Have you ever stopped to think that what we now call globalization wasn't born on the internet, but over 1,000 years ago? Strange, isn't it? While you're sipping a hot coffee or ordering food through an app, men and women crossed deserts, seas, and walls to bring spices, silks, and even ideas to the tables of Europe. And at the center of it all was a city that seemed eternal, Constantinople. But what almost no one tells us is that behind the glitter of precious stones and the scent of spices, there was also rigid control, political intrigue, inequality, and even betrayals that changed the course of history. Byzantine trade wasn't just about goods, it was about power, faith, and survival. A fascinating paradox. The city that fed the world also wore itself out with its own wealth. And you might be surprised to discover how much of what we experience today, from the way we use money to the way we think about cultural diversity, has roots in this empire that fell nearly 6 centuries ago. It seems unlikely, but the bridges they built remain standing, even if invisible. So as you settle in to relax, prepare for a slow, peaceful journey through the routine, markets, and disputes that made Byzantium the link between East and West. Close your eyes if you wish, and imagine the sounds of a medieval fair, the mingled smells of bread and incense, the sound of coins falling on wood. This is the story that will lull you to sleep tonight. By the way, before we begin, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. It'll be interesting to see from where in the world this conversation about the Byzantine past is being heard. The legacy of the Roman Empire was not just imposing ruins or ancient roads. It was also a legacy of position. The Byzantine Empire was born at a meeting point where the sun illuminating Asia met the cold breeze sweeping across Europe. It was as if the world had decided to establish there, between seas and lands, a central counter for all possible exchanges. Imagine a great fair, only not for a neighborhood but for entire civilizations. Upon waking, a Byzantine merchant didn't just think about his daily bread. He remembered that his trade sustained an entire empire. While today someone picks up their cell phone to check messages, he watched the ships arriving at the port, bringing silk, spices, and perfumes, carrying the scents of distant deserts and forests. It was a routine that blended the simple with the grand, as if opening the window were a glimpse into the life of other worlds. This strategic position was not just geographical, it was almost spiritual, because from there they set out ideas, religions, and philosophies spread silently, crossing invisible borders. Today we do this via Wi-Fi. Back then, it was at the slow pace of a camel's footsteps or the rocking of a caravan. It's curious how time changes the means, but not so much the essence of communication. Imagine, for example, a merchant selling wine in Anatolia who, without really understanding, saw Persian and Latin coins falling into his bag. It was as if he were traveling without leaving his place. This feeling of being at the center of the world, without having taken a single step, was unique. Perhaps if someone asked you what the center of the world is today, you would say New York, London, or even the internet. But back then, it was Byzantium, and the most striking thing is to think how this centrality shaped daily life. The bread the merchant ate, the oil that lit his lamp, the cloth that covered his table, everything could have come from far away, as if each simple gesture was a reminder that he was connected to something great. It's like drinking coffee in the morning without realizing that the bean could have come from Colombia or Ethiopia, and this routine of blending the local with the distant would be just the beginning, for the empire was not only a passageway, but also a guard. It controlled the entrances and exits, like someone holding the key to a great door. And that's where merchants, little by little, would begin to gain even more importance, transforming simple business into an art that would sustain generations. When Constantine decided to found a new capital, it wasn't by chance. He chose a small city called Byzantium and transformed it into Constantinople, like someone taking an ordinary stone and polishing it into a jewel. The location was perfect, surrounded by water on almost all sides, with natural walls and harbors capable of receiving vessels of all kinds. It was like setting up a chessboard with the pieces already perfectly positioned before the game began. At dawn, the inhabitants of Constantinople saw a city bustling with commerce. The sound of hammers on the docks, the mingled voices of Greeks, Persians, Syrians, Jews, and even barbarians echoed through the narrow streets. The smell of fresh bread mingled with spices from India. Imagine the sensation of walking to the market and, without leaving your street, smelling aromas of places you might never have visited. Constantinople quickly became a mirror of the world's diversity. It was common to find an Arab merchant discussing prices with a Venetian, while an Orthodox monk watched from afar, wary of the temptations of profit. This blend gave the city a unique rhythm, neither entirely Eastern nor entirely West. It had its own beat, almost like a music that could only be played there, and there was a curious detail. The Byzantine currency, the solidus, circulated with such prestige that many foreigners accepted it without question. It was like using dollars anywhere today. This gave merchants confidence and the city an aura of credibility. After all, who wouldn't trust a currency that everyone recognizes? It's like when you pay for something with an international credit card and feel like the whole world is connected. It's not hard to imagine the impact this had on everyday life. A simple worker buying olive oil or fabric was in effect participating in a global trade. It was as if every trivial gesture had a greater impact. Just as today you can order something online and not realize it's crossed oceans before it arrives at your door. This was the quiet magic of Constantinople, and as time passed, the city grew with walls, churches, and markets. Each stone placed there seemed to reinforce the idea that this place was not just a city, but the beating heart of the empire. But with so much movement, disputes, jealousies, and conflicts would also arise. After all. The more light, the more shadows appeared. Bosphorus Strait was like a vital vein that fed the body of the Byzantine Empire, a narrow stretch of sea, but one that carried with it the power to unite world. Imagine a funnel through which everything must pass: grain from Ukraine, furs from the steppes, silk that crossed deserts, and spices that perfumed entire ships. Geography there was not a detail, it was destiny. Those who lived in Constantinople knew that the city was not just a place to live, but a bridge. At dawn it was common to see boats of all sizes sailing calmly along the Bosphorus, while local fishermen cast their nets. The contrast was curious. On one side the simplicity of everyday life, on the other the weight of international trade. It's like living next to a highway through which half the world's trade passes. The Bosphorus connected not only seas but also culture. A ship departing from Alexandria could arrive laden with wheat and, after passing through Constantinople, continue on to the Black Sea, reaching the fertile lands of Crimea. Each voyage was like sewing together distant stitches of the same fabric. Today it would be like watching planes take off from various parts of the world and land at the same international airport, and of course controlling this strait gave the empire an almost insurmountable advantage. The Byzantines knew that to dominate trade it wasn't enough to have ships, they needed to hold the key to the routes. The Bosphorus was that key. Those who passed through it paid taxes, obeyed rules, and often submitted to the authority of Constantinople. It's similar to modern tolls, only with a global impact. Daily life reflected this centrality. The city's markets were supplied not only by what came from Anatolia, but also by what arrived via the Bosphorus. It was common to find exotic fruits, colorful fabrics, and even unusual animals. Imagine a child's amazement upon seeing a camel or an elephant parading through the streets, brought from distant lands. This fueled the collective imagination, but this same privileged position also brought risks. The more important the strait became, the more enemies emerged seeking to control it. And over the centuries, the walls of Constantinople would have to withstand sieges and attacks precisely because of this narrow strip of sea connecting two worlds. And this is just the beginning of how geography would dictate the course of history. Byzantine merchants played an almost invisible but crucial role. They were living bridges between worlds that would otherwise never meet. Imagine a traveler leaving Antioch with colorful fabrics, and weeks later these same fabrics adorn the homes of nobles in Rome. None of this would have happened without the patient, almost silent work of these intermediaries. They carried not only goods, but also ideas, beliefs, and even custom. Consider the routine of these men. Upon waking, even before sunrise, they organized inventory, negotiated prices, and checked currencies. The conversations were long, often shrouded in suspicion, as no one wanted to be left at a disadvantage. It's curious to think that, while today you can compare prices on apps, back then, a merchant relied solely on his ability to read looks and intentions, and there was a magic in this coming and going of product. A simple barrel of spices carried with it the scent of India, invading the Byzantine fairs. A roll of silk bore the mystery of China in its fibers. Each object was more than merchandise. It was a piece of the condensed world. Today, when someone opens a box of international purchases, they feel a hint of that same emotion, the sensation of touching something distant. These merchants were in a sense teachers without books. Speaking of lands unknown to anyone, they transmitted knowledge orally, almost like storytellers. Imagine a young Byzantine sitting in a tavern, listening to tales of endless deserts, raging seas, or golden cities. He might never see these places, but he could already dream of them. It's not much different from watching a documentary tonight and traveling without leaving the couch. What was most fascinating was how this exchange shaped identities. Gradually, Constantinople became filled with accents, distinct cuisines, and exotic clothing. This created a cosmopolitan atmosphere where every corner seemed like a cultural crossroads. If today we speak of global cities like New York or Dubai, back then it was Byzantium that held that title without the need for skyscrapers or neon lights. But this intermediary status also came at a price. Merchants were often viewed with suspicion, accused of growing rich by trading without producing anything, and yet, without them, East and West would remain isolated from each other. This duality, admiration and criticism, would haunt the Byzantines for centuries, paving the way for even more bitter disputes. At that time, every commodity that crossed the walls of Constantinople seemed to carry with it a piece of a distant world. Chinese silk, for example, was more than just a fabric. It was a symbol of status, luxury, and mystery. When a Roman lady walked down the street wearing silk, she wasn't just wearing clothing, she carried the aura of lands most would never know. It was like displaying, without words, that she was connected to the unattainable. Spices were perhaps even more fascinating. Imagine a medieval cuisine, often marked by simplicity, transformed with a little cinnamon, pepper, or nutmeg. These seasonings changed flavors, but they also transformed perceptions. Spiced banquet was like a spectacle, a way to impress guests. It's curious how, even today, when someone tries a different food, they feel transported to another place. Precious stones had a similar effect, but of a different nature. They reflected not only light, but also power. Crowns, necklaces, and rings studded with rubies, sapphires, or emeralds were not just adornments. They were political statements. Each stone came with its own story, crossing deserts, seas, and cities, until it rested in the hands of kings or emperors.
Today, something similar happens with luxury brands. You don't just buy an object, you buy a status. The impact of this on daily life was subtle but present. A simple citizen might never be able to afford silk or precious stones, but they felt the echoes of this presence. The scent of spices in the air at the fairs, the sparkle of jewels seen from afar in processions, or even the superior fabrics arriving at the market. It was like being close to something unattainable and yet feeling part of it. The merchants, in turn, knew they carried more than just goods in their hands, they carried dreams. The effort to bring these riches was enormous. Long journeys, constant dangers, tense negotiations. But at the same time, each successful delivery enriched not only themselves, but also the culture that developed around these products. After all, those who try a new spice rarely cook the same way again, and over time, these exchanges shaped not only tastes and clothing styles, but also mindsets. By opening space for the exotic, people learned to see the world more broadly. It was as if each commodity were a lesson in disguise, a window to the unknown. And these windows, little by little, would multiply, revealing not only riches, but also new ways of living. Life in Byzantium wasn't just about wealth from the East. Europe also had much to offer. Metals, for example, circulated as true pillars of the economy. Iron, copper, silver, and sometimes even gold traveled by road and sea, reaching Byzantine markets. They were used to make weapons, coins, and utensils, sustaining both trade and domestic life. It's curious to think that a simple metal fork, which we hardly value today, could be considered an object of prestige. European wool was also highly valued.
Transformed into durable fabrics, it warmed soldiers, monks, and families on cold days. It was a basic but vital product, carrying the burden of survival in a world that didn't know electric heating. Imagine waking up on a freezing morning and finding the comfort of a wool blanket, the same blanket that in Byzantium could have become a luxury item if well crafted by local artisans. Wine was perhaps the product that most revealed the European spirit. Each jug that crossed borders carried with it the flavor of a territory, the mark of the grape, and the soil where it had grown. For the Byzantines, receiving Western wine was like tasting history in a bottle. It's similar to what happens today when someone tries a Chilean, Italian, or Portuguese wine. Each sip carries more than flavor, it carries identity. And olive oil, that liquid gold, was indispensable, used for cooking, lighting lamps, and even in religious rituals. European olive oil found a guaranteed place on trade routes. Those who walked through the markets of Constantinople could smell its distinctive aroma, mingled with spices and fresh bread. It was a simple product, but it represented life, warmth, and continuity. It's like coffee for us today, a habit that's not discussed, just practiced. These exchanges created a curious balance. On one side, the exoticism of the East, on the other, the rusticity and strength of Europe. When they met in Byzantium, these products seemed to converse with each other, as if each commodity were a word in a single dialogue. It was at this meeting point that trade gained its greatest strength, because it combined the useful with the extraordinary. And for merchants, managing this diversity was almost an art. Knowing how much a bundle of wool was worth compared to a handful of pepper required sensitivity and experience. This art of balancing values would gradually become the key to expanding trade and maintaining Byzantium as a pulsating center of global exchange. In the 6th century, a nearly secret story changed the course of Byzantine trade. Traveling monks in disguise brought silkworm eggs from China, hidden in simple bamboo staffs. It sounds like a scene from a spy movie, but it was silk, previously controlled by the Chinese, began to be produced in Byzantine lands as well. This gave the empire not only wealth but immense symbolic power. After all, controlling silk was like holding the very language of luxury in one's hands. Imagine the impact this had on everyday life. Until then, wearing silk was a rare privilege, almost inaccessible to Westerners. With production in Byzantium, the fabrics began to circulate more frequently, even though they remained expensive. On the streets of Constantinople, it was not uncommon to see nobles wearing tunics that reflected the sunlight mesmerizingly. It was as if the city had taken on new colors, coming directly from the secretly produced threads. The monopoly transformed the Byzantine economy. Weaving workshops sprang up in various locations, employing artisans who spent days and nights manipulating delicate threads. Each fabric was treated as a work of art, and some were even used as diplomatic gifts, sent to kings and foreign leaders. It was as if the empire had found a way to speak without words, offering silk instead of speeches. This production also generated a network of rigid controls. The Byzantine state didn't allow just anyone to produce or trade silk. There were inspections, taxes, and even severe punishments for those who tried to circumvent the system. It was the medieval equivalent of today's major patents, like companies that hold secret formulas or exclusive technologies. The silk monopoly was an asset the empire couldn't afford to lose, and of course this aroused envy. Other nations looked on with suspicion and greed, trying to find ways to break this dominance. But for centuries, Byzantium held the lead, ensuring not only profit but also prestige. It was as if every meter of fabric bore the seal of the empire's greatness. It was no wonder that many foreigners came to the city just to acquire these products, which would later be resold at exorbitant prices. This secret, which began with a silent journey of monks, didn't stop at silk. It paved the way for Byzantium to further understand the importance of controlling what circulated within its borders. And so the city prepared to transform each commodity into an instrument of political and cultural power. In Byzantium, trade wasn't a free activity, like someone setting up a makeshift market stall. The state kept a close eye on every transaction, every coin that exchanged hands. It was as if the empire had constructed an invisible but secure web in which all merchants were trapped. This provided security, true, but it also limited individual ambitions. Selling wasn't just a matter of talent, but of permission. Upon waking, a merchant didn't just think about organizing his ware. He had to consider what taxes he would pay that day, what inspections he might face, what new regulations the emperor had decreed. It was almost like opening a business today and dealing with a sea of bureaucracy. Only back then, the consequences weren't just fines. They could involve imprisonment or loss of assets. This rigidity, curiously, also underpinned the credibility of Byzantine trade. Those who shopped in Constantinople knew that prices were regulated and that there were quality standards. This was unlike other markets, where luck dictated whether a product was good or not. Here, state discipline made the act of shopping trustworthy. It's like walking into a store with a certification seal today. You pay more, but you know what you're getting. For merchants, the challenge lay in finding loopholes. Many tried to negotiate secretly, evade taxes, or bribe inspectors. This cat-and-mouse relationship was as old as trade itself. Who hasn't tried, in some way, to avoid a cost deemed unfair? But in Byzantium, this required extra skill, because control was constant and the risks enormous. In everyday life, the impact was clear. The price of bread that ordinary citizens bought at the market was set by the state. This prevented abuses, but also left little room for vendors. Imagine living in a place where even the price of your breakfast is decided from the top down. In some ways, it guaranteed stability. In others, it stifled creativity. This fragile balance between security and oppression demonstrated how Byzantium viewed trade. not just as a source of wealth, but as an instrument of power. And gradually, this same control, so effective at first, would become a source of tension, pushing some merchants to seek new paths beyond the shadow of the imperial walls. The fairs of Constantinople were a spectacle in themselves. They weren't just about trade, but a veritable living encyclopedia of cultures. Among the narrow corridors and warehouses filled with goods, Arabic, Greek, Hebrew, Latin, and even distant dialects could be heard. The Arabs brought intense perfumes, refined jewelry, and carpets that seemed to carry stories within their designs. The Jews, with their mercantile tradition, often acted as trusted intermediaries, connecting peoples who alone might never trade. The Venetians, for their part, were practical and objective. They arrived with their ships laden with salt, wine, and textiles, but above all with the ability to gain political clout within the city. They didn't just come to sell, they also came to secure privileges, agreements, and advantages that would later make them dangerous rivals of the Byzantine Empire itself. It was a delicate coexistence, necessary but not always peaceful. What's curious is how the common people reacted to this diversity. For many residents of Constantinople, walking through the fair was almost like traveling around the world in a morning. The scent of Indian spices mingled with the sound of Hebrew chants, while a Venetian animatedly discussed transportation fees. For us, it was like visiting a modern international fair, only squeezed within the city walls. And it wasn't just an exchange of goods, there was also an exchange of ideas, knowledge, and even gossip. It was in environments like these that news spread about new routes, inventions, and even political conflict. The foreign merchant wasn't just a salesman, he was also a messenger, a spokesperson for what was happening beyond borders. Today, the equivalent might be the news feed on a cell phone. Multiple voices, multiple interests, all mixed together in the same space. Of course, this foreign presence aroused contradictory feelings. There was fascination with the novelty, but also distrust. Some Byzantines saw the foreigners as indispensable allies, others as potential infiltrated enemies. This tension hung in the air, and it was impossible to ignore it. After all, each coin exchanged carried not only economic but also political value. And little by little, this coexistence between local and foreign merchants would shape the fate of Byzantine trade. Amidst the blending of cultures, powerful alliances would emerge, but also disputes that at times would threaten the very survival of the city. The fairs of Constantinople were not simple markets. They were veritable social and economic spectacles. Imagine entire streets transformed into corridors of colors, sounds, and smells. Flags fluttered, goods were displayed on carpets or makeshift tables, and voices overlapped in different languages. It was as if the entire world had decided to meet there, in the heart of the empire, at least for a few days. Travelers arrived from all corners. From the north came soft furs, brought by Slavic peoples. From the south, Arab caravans unloaded spices and perfume. From the west, Venetians and Genoese brought fabrics and wine. And from the east, brilliant silks and precious stones. Each group added its own mark to the fair, transforming Constantinople into a living mosaic of cultures. It was, without exaggeration, a preview of what we now call globalization for ordinary people. Visiting these fairs was an unforgettable experience. Children ran between the stalls, marveling at wooden toys or exotic sweets. Adults lost themselves in long negotiations, where every word could change the final purchase price. Even the smells were a draw. Imagine walking down an aisle and simultaneously smelling the aroma of baked bread, oriental incense, and freshly worked leather. These events were also moments of display of power. Byzantine authorities circulated to ensure order, and the emperor often made a point of being seen, reinforcing his image as the guardian of prosperity.
It was a way of demonstrating that, despite the diversity of peoples and interests, everything was under the empire's control. As with major modern exhibitions, the fair was not just a place of commerce, it was also political propaganda. For merchants, the fair was a golden opportunity. In just a few days, they could close deals that would sustain months of work. It was the ideal time to present new products, form alliances, or even plan future trips. Many travelers met only at these annual gatherings, and from there friendships, rivalries, and stories spanned generations. And more than just trade, the fairs left memory. Those who attended them took home not only goods, but also memories, stories, and even customs. Gradually, these experiences helped shape Constantinople's own cultural identity, which increasingly became a reflection of the entire world. And this was just the prelude to how the empire would continue to shine as a mercantile center. The Saladas was more than just a coin, it was a symbol of trust. While other kingdoms faced crises, devaluation, and counterfeit currencies, Byzantine gold remained stable, almost unshakable. It's like that friend who never fails in times of turmoil. Everyone knew they could count on it. This made the Saladas one of the most respected currencies of the medieval world, accepted from London to Cairo. For merchants, carrying Saladas was like having a universal passport. Wherever they went, they knew their currency would be recognized and accepted without suspicion. It was unlike local coins, which were often weighed, tested, and even bitten to verify authenticity. The Saladas required no proof. Its value was engraved not only in the metal but also in the empire's reputation. In everyday life, this trust was reflected in commerce. A simple payment in Saladas could guarantee the quick closure of a deal that, with other currencies, would drag on for days. This accelerated transactions, shortened discussions, and expanded the business network. It's similar to what happens today with the dollar. Even in distant countries, it maintains its strength as a benchmark. Gold itself also had psychological value. Holding a Saladas, one saw not just a shiny piece of metal, but the promise of stability. It carried the image of the emperor, reinforcing the idea that currency was not only economic, but also political. It was as if, with each transaction, the citizen was reminded of the authority that sustained that system. This prestige naturally attracted counterfeiters, but the quality of Byzantine gold, always maintained at a high purity, made life difficult for swindlers. Many preferred to simply exchange local currencies for Saladas, knowing that upon returning home, they would still have the same value intact. This transformed Constantinople into a veritable international bank, where the world's most reliable currency circulated in abundance. And it's curious to think that the strength of a simple coin helped sustain the Byzantine Empire's image of greatness for centuries. But like all history, even the Saladas would encounter moments of crisis, when external and internal pressures began to threaten its stability. The ports of Constantinople were like open doors to the world. Immense, bustling, and well organized, they welcomed ships of all sizes, laden with riches from faraway places. Upon arrival, travelers were immediately enveloped by the sound of ropes being pulled, anchors banging against the water, and sailors shouting in various languages. It was a spectacle of voices, the smells of salt and merchandise mingling in the air. The warehouses, strategically built near the docks, were veritable stone giants. There, spices, wines, fabrics, and metals were carefully stored until they were sent to the city's markets. Imagine endless corridors filled with crates and barrels, each carrying stories from different lands. For those who worked in these spaces, each day was a short journey without leaving home. The routine at the ports began while there was still fog on the sea. One could already see shippers carrying heavy loads on their shoulders, merchants recording inventories, and inspectors checking cargo to ensure all taxes were paid. It was a silent but essential choreography, where every role had its value. Today, it would be like observing the workings of a large international airport, intense, chaotic, yet organized.
And there was also cultural diversity. Walking along the docks, one could hear Arabic music coming from a group of sailors, while Italian merchants animatedly discussed prices. This mix made the port not only an economic space, but also a social one. It was there that news spread, unlikely friendships were born, and trade alliances were sealed. For the citizens of Constantinople, the port was synonymous with abundance. It was from here that came the wheat that filled their bakeries, the olive oil that illuminated their homes, and the silks that adorned their processions. Each ship that docked meant more than merchandise. It meant life, security, and continuity. Those who gazed at the waters of the Bosphorus saw, in the aligned masts, a reflection of the empire's grandeur. But this beating heart was also vulnerable. The more riches circulated through the ports, the more greedy enemies and pirates grew. And over the centuries, protecting these spaces would become a top priority for the empire, reinforcing the importance of its navy and walls. The Byzantine navy was not just a military arm, it was the backbone of the empire's trade. Without it, ships laden with silk, spices, and precious metals would have been at the mercy of pirates or enemies. Imagine an ocean filled with vulnerable, unprotected vessels. Chaos would be inevitable. It was thanks to the navy that Constantinople was able to maintain its safe trade routes and ensure the empire's economic heartbeat. Daily life in the ports reflected this security. At dawn, when the white sails appeared on the horizon, everyone knew the ships were escorted. This sight brought peace of mind, not only to the merchants but also to the population, who depended on the cargo for survival. Today, it would be like following a convoy of trucks under police escort, carrying essential food supplies for a large city. The secret of Byzantine strength also lay in its technology. Ships were precision engineered, and the navy wielded feared weapons such as the famous Greek fire, an incendiary substance that burned even on water. Just hearing stories of this power discouraged many enemies from attacking. It was like possessing a weapon bordering on magic, a resource that intimidated even before it was used. For the sailors, the routine was harsh but purposeful. They trained not only to fight, but to maintain order on the high sea. Life on board was a disciplined affair. Rowing, keeping watch, repairing sails, all in endless cycles. Still, there was pride in serving in the Byzantine navy, as each successful mission meant protecting not only goods, but the very survival of Constantinople. The impact on trade was immediate. Merchants knew that by entrusting their goods to Byzantine routes, they were investing in security. This trust was reflected in prices, partnerships, and the constant expansion of trade. It was like trusting a renowned airline today. You pay more, but the guarantee of reaching your destination is worth the investment. And yet, this protection brought with it a challenge. Sustaining a powerful navy required immense resource. Taxes, fees, and constant effort were required to keep the vessels ready. Gradually, this balance between security and cost would begin to tip, showing that even the strongest of empires could not maintain control forever. Byzantine trade wasn't limited to spices and silk. The fertile lands of Anatolia and the vineyards scattered across the Greek hills provided products coveted in both East and West. Olive oil and wine, seemingly simple, carried the flavor of everyday life, becoming commodities that traveled as far as precious stone. It was curious how something so common on a peasant's table could cross seas and be enjoyed at royal banquets. Olive oil in particular was considered indispensable, used not only for cooking, but also for lighting lamps, and in religious rituals, it was a kind of liquid gold. Imagine the scene: a Byzantine house at dusk, lit by small flickering flames, all fueled by olive oil. Today, when we light a lamp with the simple flick of a switch, we rarely think of this symbolism of fire as an extension of life. Wine, in turn, had its own prestige. Produced in different regions, it carried the unique characteristics of each soil. Some were light and sweet, others full-bodied and strong, each reflecting the local climate and culture. On ships, barrels of wine were carefully stored to arrive at the fairs intact. For the people who received these cargoes, drinking Greek wine was like tasting the essence of the Mediterranean. These agricultural products also sustained the domestic economy. They were not just luxury items, but an essential part of the Byzantine diet. Bread dipped in olive oil, roasted fish washed down with wine. All these were part of common meals. It's interesting to consider how these ancient habits still resonate today in the Mediterranean diet, considered one of the healthiest in the world. And there was also the social aspect. Wine accompanied meetings, celebrations, and even trade negotiations. It was not uncommon to see merchants sealing deals while toasting with simple glasses filled with local wine. In a way, trade was not just a matter of numbers, but also of conviviality, of sharing moments around the table. These exports demonstrated that the empire depended not only on foreign imports, but also had much to offer, and this self-sufficiency, albeit relative, reinforced the idea that Byzantium was not only a consumer, but also a producer. This raised an inevitable question: how to balance pride in its own wealth with the constant temptation of what came from distant lands. Byzantine art had something hypnotic about it. The icons, painted in vivid colors and intense gold, were not just religious objects, they were windows to the sacred. Each line carried profound symbolism meant to inspire devotion while simultaneously striking with beauty. It wasn't long before these icons crossed borders and reached Western churches, where they were viewed with fascination, as if they were fragments of a distant spiritual world. Mosaics were another hallmark. Using small colored stones and pieces of glass, Byzantine artisans created images that seemed to come to life when illuminated by sunlight. Imagine entering a basilica and seeing the walls shimmer as if made of miniature stars. This experience for Western travelers was almost indescribable. It's no wonder many wanted to take home pieces of this aesthetic. In trade, these artistic objects functioned as gifts and prestige products. A Western prince who received a Byzantine icon not only received a work of art, but also the prestige of being closer to Constantinople, seen as a center of faith and culture. It was like receiving an exclusive piece from a renowned studio today, something that goes beyond its material value. And there was also the influence on everyday life. Even simple families might have had smaller icons in their homes, used in prayers and daily rituals. These objects, when exported, carried with them not only art, but also Byzantine spirituality. It was like exporting not only the product, but also the soul of an entire culture. This cultural exchange helped shape the very identity of the West. Many artistic styles that emerged in Europe bore traces of Byzantine aesthetics: the grandeur, the use of gold, the fixed, enigmatic gazes of the figures. It was as if Byzantium had planted seeds that would flourish in foreign lands, giving rise to new visual expression. But at the same time, this artistic export created tension. For some, Byzantine art was divine, for others excessive, almost oppressive. Still, the fascination was inescapable, and the objects continued to circulate along trade routes. After all, Who could resist the brilliance of a mosaic or the mystical aura of a hand-painted icon? The Silk Road was more than a caravan route. It was an invisible thread that wove the world together, and Byzantium for centuries held the power to control part of that thread. Imagine the privilege of being at the crossroads where Chinese silk, Indian spices, Persian carpets, and even philosophical ideas passed. Constantinople functioned as a kind of global customs house where nothing entered or left without leaving its mark on the empire. The merchants knew this position was pure gold. When they woke in the morning, many already knew that their businesses depended not only on good products, but also on Byzantine protection and control over the trade route. It was like living in a house next to the only bridge connecting two cities. Whoever controls the bridge controls everything that passes over it. This monopoly of passage had both practical and symbolic effect. Products that came from so far away seemed to gain even more value when they passed through Constantinople. The mere fact that they had passed through Byzantine hands increased their aura of exclusive. It's similar to a seal of quality today. When something is said to come from such and such a place, prestige accompanies the merchandise. Daily life was also shaped by this position. Local markets filled with exotic objects and aromas, transforming the daily routine of Byzantine family. A meal could feature spices from India, fabrics from China, and wine from Greece, all gathered on the same table. It was like living inside a global showcase, without having to travel miles to experience new things. Of course, this control generated tension. Neighboring peoples coveted the same routes, and alliances were often broken by trade disputes. The Byzantines had to balance diplomacy and military force to maintain their privileged position. It was a constant power play in which one slip-up could mean the loss of not only goods, but also political influence. And as solid as it seemed, this dominance would not last forever. New routes began to emerge, and with them, rivals willing to fight for the same space. But for many centuries, Byzantium reigned supreme, as guardian of the most coveted route in the ancient world, and this role would shape not only its economy, but also its identity as a bridge between worlds. The Crusades, which began as religious expeditions, ended up redrawing the map of medieval trade. When thousands of knights and pilgrims crossed territories toward the Holy Land, they brought not only swords and shields, they also brought the need for provisions, transportation, and safe routes. And this is where Venice and Genoa entered the scene, transforming themselves from simple merchant cities into true maritime powerhouses. The Venetians, with their political skill, seized the opportunity to negotiate trade privileges with the Crusaders. Not only did they transport entire armies, but they also secured monopolies in strategic ports. Imagine a modern logistics company that, in addition to delivering goods, also controls the warehouses and roads through which everything flows. That's exactly what Venice did. Genoa, with its growing fleet, established bases in the eastern Mediterranean, encroaching dangerously close to the routes once dominated by the Byzantines. Its merchants were swift, cunning, and knew how to exploit every gap left by the empire. Gradually, both Genoa and Venice became indispensable, not only to the Crusaders but to trade in general. For Byzantium, this represented a silent threat. If Constantinople had previously been the main bridge between East and West, now Italian-controlled shortcuts were emerging. It was as if a road that once passed through its gates had begun to have detours, and the toll could no longer be charged to all comers. This change shook the foundations of the Byzantine economy. Interestingly, while many saw the Crusades as mere holy wars,
Italian merchants saw them as a business opportunity. Indeed, they filled their coffers more with commercial contracts than with military conquest. This pragmatic outlook allowed Venice and Genoa to grow to the point of challenging the empire itself. And when the Fourth Crusade took an unexpected turn, the effects would be devastating for Constantinople. But even before that, the seed of change was already planted. European trade would no longer depend solely on Byzantine control. The rivalry between Byzantine and Italian merchants was like an endless chess match played out across the Mediterranean. On one side were the Byzantines, owners of a centuries-old tradition, accustomed to controlling trade routes and taxes. On the other were the Italians, especially the Venetians and Genoese, ambitious, bold, and ready to seize any open space.
This struggle wasn't just about profits, it was also about prestige, power, and survival. In everyday life, ports were the scene of these tensions. Imagine two merchants arguing heatedly over docking fees, each representing interests greater than their own store. A Byzantine defended the empire's historic right to these waters, while a Venetian claimed agreements made during the Crusades. The scene might seem trivial, but it concealed much larger political battles. This competition was also reflected in the markets. Italian products began to be sold at more affordable prices, challenging the Byzantines to reinvent themselves. It was like when a new supermarket chain arrives in a city, offering promotions and changing consumer habits. The average customer might not understand the political implications of this, but they felt it directly in their pockets. For the Byzantines, this rivalry was painful. After all, they saw foreigners encroaching on their own turf, negotiating with authority within Constantinople. Many chroniclers of the time report popular dissatisfaction with the privileges granted to the Venetians and Genoese. It was as if the empire was being slowly corroded from within, not with swords but with coins and contracts. The Italians, on the other hand, saw this as a golden opportunity. The more Byzantium weakened, the more ground they gained. Their fleets grew, their colonies spread, and their influence increased. For them, this rivalry was not a problem. It was the springboard that would lead them to dominance in Mediterranean trade. And like all intense rivalries, the outcome was not long in coming. The fragile balance between cooperation and competition would soon be shattered, and the empire would pay a heavy price for having opened its doors to such determined rivals. The year 1204 marked a deep wound in the history of Byzantium. The Fourth Crusade, which was supposed to be heading towards the Holy Land, took an unexpected and devastating turn. Constantinople, the jewel of the empire, was sacked by those who claimed to be allies of the Christian faith. Imagine the pain of seeing your own home invaded not by declared enemies but by those who came under the banner of the cross. The looting was brutal. Churches were broken into, altars desecrated, and sacred relics carried off as mere trophies. The golden mosaics that once gleamed in the candlelight were ripped out, melted down, or sold. The sound of prayers was replaced by the clash of swords, screams, and stampedes. For the common people, it was like waking from a dream of grandeur to plunge into a nightmare of destruction. The impact on trade was immediate. Entire warehouses were looted, ships destroyed, and trade routes disrupted. Merchants who had previously circulated freely now found themselves in chaos, without protection or stability. Constantinople, once synonymous with trust and prosperity, became marked by insecurity. It was as if the world's most famous shop window had been shattered in front of everyone. And it wasn't just the material that was lost. There was also a loss of reputation. Trading partners, who previously viewed Byzantium as a reliable hub, began seeking alternatives in other ports. This shift in trust was even more devastating than the loss of precious objects. It's similar to a company that, after a scandal, sees its customers migrate to competitors even though the products remain the same. For the people, they were left to deal with the daily grind of ruin. Entire families lost their homes, merchants saw their working lives reduced to ashes, and the once proud city had to rebuild slowly. The glitter of the markets was replaced by silence and distrust, and commerce, once the heart of the empire, began to slow down. But like every story of decline, this one also concealed the beginning of a transformation. For even wounded, Constantinople would not cease to be desired, and this scar would pave the way for new disputes in which trade and politics would become even more intertwined. Constantinople seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to rebuild itself. Even after invasions, political crises, and periods of famine, the city never lost its mercantile essence. It was like a flame that, no matter how much the wind blew, stubbornly refused to go out. Merchants returned, warehouses reopened, and the flow of ships never completely ceased. This resilience made Constantinople unique, as if it were made of stone and hope at the same time. In everyday life, this force translated into ordinary scenes. After a period of instability, the fairs were once again filled with voices, smells, and colors. Children ran between stalls, sailors unloaded ships, and ordinary citizens returned to buy bread, wine, and olive oil. Life insisted on going on, and trade was the engine that kept the empire breathing again. It's curious to see how commerce has this ability to restore confidence even after disasters. The products circulating through the streets of Constantinople brought with them a sense of normalcy. Chinese silk or an Indian spice acted almost like invisible remedies against despair. It was as if the simple act of trading was also an act of reconstruction. Foreign merchants, often viewed with suspicion, also contributed to this recovery. After all, they had a vested interest in keeping Constantinople afloat. This benefited the Byzantines, but also the Italians, Arabs, and other peoples who depended on the flow of goods. This network of interdependence helped the city endure when elsewhere would have succumbed, even weakened. Constantinople continued to be seen as an indispensable center. It was a point on the map that could not be ignored, because it concentrated routes, cultures, and wealth. For its neighbors, conquering the city meant dominating a symbol, not just a territory. This explains why so many empires coveted its walls. But of course, all resistance has its limits, and however resilient Constantinople might be, its fall in 1453 would demonstrate that not even trade, with all its lifeblood, could indefinitely sustain an empire besieged by enemy. Yet, until its last breath, the city maintained its identity as the greatest entrepot between East and West. Arab merchants didn't just bring goods to Constantinople, they also brought knowledge. With them came new methods of calculation, ways of recording transactions, and systems that facilitated financial control. It was as if, along with the spices and fabrics, came an invisible manual for better managing trade. For the Byzantines, this meant modernizing their practices and keeping the empire competitive. Arabic mathematics, for example, revolutionized accounting. The use of zero, algorithms, and even basic algebraic concepts allowed complex calculations to be performed more quickly and accurately. Imagine a merchant negotiating a shipment of silk. With new techniques, he could calculate prices, profits, and rates with less risk of error. It was like trading a wooden ruler for a modern calculator. This knowledge wasn't limited to large merchants. Little artisans, tax collectors, and even simple workers learned more efficient ways to handle numbers. This was reflected in everyday life.
clearer notes, fairer prices, and fewer arguments at markets. For ordinary people, it was a silent advance, but one that made life easier. And there was also the issue of trust. With more organized records, it was harder to cheat. A merchant trying to cheat another would have to deal with detailed account books, which served as proof. This increased the credibility of Byzantine trade, attracting even more foreigners. It was similar to the feeling we have today when using digital bank statements. More security, less room for error. The cultural impact of this was enormous. In addition to mathematics, the Arabs also brought instruments like the abacus and more uniform systems of weights and measures. These tools facilitated exchanges and reduced misunderstandings. It's as if, when negotiating, everyone began to speak the same language of numbers, even though they came from different cultures. This influence demonstrated that trade was more than just an exchange of goods, it was also an exchange of ideas. And Constantinople, by absorbing these advances, further strengthened its position as a center of learning and innovation. But along with this knowledge came new forms of competition, which would require the empire to possess the wisdom to navigate an increasingly complex landscape. Walking through the markets of Constantinople was like entering a living treasure trove. Among fabrics, spices, and wines, there were also products that immediately sparked curiosity. African ivory and Baltic amber. Ivory carved into delicate shapes was transformed into crucifixes, game pieces, or furniture ornament. Amber, with its golden sheen and resinous aroma, was used in jewelry, perfumes, and even medicines. These objects carried the mystery of distant places. Ivory came from African lands, transported in long caravans to ports and then transported by ship. Each piece carried with it the weight of human labor and the adventure of crossing deserts and seas. For the Byzantines, having an ivory object in one's home was a sign of wealth and sophistication. It was like displaying a rare item today, acquired on exclusive voyages, inaccessible to most. Amber, on the other hand, came from the frozen north, from the shores of the Baltic Sea. Many believed it had mystical powers capable of curing illnesses or protecting against evil spirits. It wasn't just an ornament, it was an amulet. Imagine the sensation of holding a translucent stone, which seemed to imprison the sun within. To the common people, amber was almost magical. In everyday life, few had direct access to these products, but their mere presence in the markets fueled stories and fantasies. Children heard tales of distant lands where amber was collected as if it were mere stone, or of giant animals whose tusks were turned into ivory. These narratives, more than the objects themselves, reinforced Constantinople's aura as a center of wonder. For merchants, trading in such rare products required caution. They had to ensure authenticity, avoid counterfeits, and deal with demanding customers. Ivory and amber were not common commodities. They were prestigious items, often used as diplomatic gifts or religious offerings. Trading with them was almost an act of power, and as these objects circulated, they created invisible bridges between continents that seemed impossible to connect. From Africa to the Baltic, all roads led to Byzantium, and this network of exotic goods made the city a mirror of the known world, a mirror that would still show new images as trade expanded. Byzantine trade, though rich in silk, spices, and precious stones, also had a dark side, the slave trade. Among the luxurious goods, there were also human beings treated as mere objects of exchange. Many of these slaves came from the northern regions, especially Slavic peoples, hence the origin of the word slave. Others were captured in war or purchased from intermediaries who traversed unstable borders. In the markets of Constantinople, it was common to find squares dedicated to the sale of people. Strong men were destined for hard labor, women often for domestic servitude or exploitation, and children ended up serving as bargaining chips for indebted families. The scene was cruel: public auctions, buyers evaluating teeth, muscles, or even specific skills, something that causes horror today, but back then was part of the economic machinery.
In daily life, slaves performed a variety of functions. They worked in kitchens, in the fields, on public works, and even as soldiers or eunuchs in the imperial palace. Some managed, over time, to gain the trust of their masters and even gain their freedom, but most lived a harsh and silent routine marked by forced obedience. It's a stark contrast to the modern idea of work and human dignity. For merchants, the slave trade was viewed pragmatically. It was just another commodity, alongside textiles or olive oil. This view, as inhumane as it may seem, shows how trade was not only a driver of wealth, but also of profound inequalities. It was as if the same ship carrying Chinese silk also carried chains to bind people. There were, of course, religious and moral debates surrounding this practice. Some monks denounced the slave trade, recalling Christian principles of compassion and dignity. But in practice, economic and military necessity prevailed. And so, slavery continued, sustained by an empire that saw it as a way to strengthen its power. This dark side of Byzantine trade shows that history is not all about glitter and grandeur. Behind the colorful, aromatic fares, there were also muffled cries and lives reduced to mere commodities. And this contradiction reveals much about the complexity of an empire that combined extraordinary wealth with painful practices. Constantinople was, without exaggeration, a living tower of Babel voices in Greek, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, Armenian, and even languages from the steppes could be heard throughout its narrow streets and bustling squares. This blend made the city a unique place, where every corner revealed a little piece of the world. It was like walking through a modern metropolis only 1,000 years earlier, with the diversity evident in the clothing, accents, and even the aromas that mingled in the air. Cultural diversity wasn't restricted to street market. It was also present in kitchens, where Arabic spices blended with Greek olive oil, creating dishes that surprised visitors. It was present in homes, where Oriental fabrics decorated walls, and in temples, where different religious practices coexisted side by side. For the average person, this blend wasn't an exotic novelty. It was part of everyday life. In trade, this plurality was even more evident. Foreign merchants brought with them not only goods, but also customs and story. An Italian could negotiate with a Syrian using gestures, while a Jew could mediate the conversation with knowledge of both languages. This ability to adapt and build cultural bridges was what kept trade alive and expanding. This coexistence, of course, was not always peaceful. There was distrust, rivalries, and at times open conflict between groups. But even with the tensions, the city survived as an organism that breathed diversity. It was as if Constantinople had learned to transform differences into energy, remaining vibrant despite the contradiction. For the common people, this plurality was also a source of enchantment. Children grew up listening to stories of distant lands told by travelers, while learning foreign words through daily interaction. Many Byzantines never left their hometowns, yet they still carried within them an immense cultural baggage, acquired simply by living among so many peoples. And this diversity also shaped the identity of the capital itself. Constantinople was not just Byzantine, it was Arab, Latin, Slavic, Jewish, and much more. It was a living, ever-changing mosaic, reflecting in its trade what most defined the empire: its ability to bridge different worlds. In Byzantine Constantinople, religion wasn't restricted to churches. The Orthodox Church extended its influence to markets and fairs, opining on prices, contracts, and even the morality of certain businesses. It was as if every transaction had to pass not only through the eyes of the merchant and the customer, but also through spiritual scrutiny. Profit, after all, could not be greater than faith. In everyday life, this was reflected in very practical ways. Merchants had to observe holy days when trade was suspended. There were also restrictions on what could and could not be traded. Some products, linked to pagan practices, were discouraged. Imagine being in the middle of a profitable trade and being forced to stop because the church ruled it inappropriate. This shaped entire routines. The church also influenced the way contracts were recorded. Business deals were often sealed in the presence of religious witnesses, such as priests or monks. This gave transactions moral and spiritual weight, in addition to legal validity. It was as if a contract were more than just a signed document. It was also a promise before God. This dimension reinforced trust, but also limited abuse. Interestingly, the church saw no problem with trade itself, as long as it was conducted fairly. The notion of fair pricing, championed by theologians, sought to balance the merchant's profit with the community's good. This is reminiscent of current debates about business ethics. To what extent is it legitimate to raise prices in times of need? For the Byzantines, this question was answered within the walls of the church. This connection between faith and economics created a curious environment. The markets, full of noise and movement, were always under the silent shadow of the golden domes of the basilica. It was impossible to forget that, even when selling a simple loaf of bread, there was a spiritual dimension involved. Religion was ingrained in commerce like salt in food, invisible, yet indispensable. And little by little, this influence shaped not only contracts and prices, but also people's mindsets. For many Byzantines, working and negotiating were also a way of serving God. This vision made each transaction part of a larger picture, in which economics and spirituality walked hand in hand. Life in Constantinople might have seemed stable within the walls, but trade routes outside them were constantly at risk. Wars against the Persians, Turks, and other neighboring peoples threatened the safety of caravans and ships. Imagine being a merchant about to ship your cargo of silk, unsure whether it would reach its destination or be looted along the way. Every voyage was also a gamble. These conflicts weren't just military, they had a direct impact on the pockets of those who lived off trade. When land routes were closed by battles, prices soared at markets. Wheat became more expensive, spices became rare, and even olive oil could be in short supply. Ordinary people felt the consequences of wars fought miles away at their dinner table. It's like today when international crises drive up the prices of fuel and food. For merchants, the solution was to seek alternatives. Many diverted routes, even longer ones, to ensure delivery. Others opted for maritime trade, safer under the protection of the Byzantine navy. This constant adaptation was part of the routine. Trading wasn't just about selling, but also about overcoming unforeseen circumstances and calculating risks. The enemies were well aware of the importance of these routes. Persians and Turks, for example, attacked not only cities but also caravans and strategic ports, attempting to suffocate Byzantium economically. It was a silent war, waged less with swords and more with targeted blockades and plunder. And this strategy often proved as effective as a direct siege. The curious thing is that, even amidst so many conflicts, trade never completely stopped. There were always merchants willing to take risks, soldiers protecting cargo, and alternative routes emerging. The need to keep Constantinople supplied was so great that not even prolonged wars could silence the movement. Trade was quite literally stubborn. Still, these wars left deep scars. Not only did they raise the price of goods, but they also undermined the empire's image as a secure center of trade. And this loss of trust would be a difficult specter to dispel, especially when new rivals began to gain traction along the same route. As the centuries passed, Byzantium's splendor began to fade. The walls still stood firm, the market still echoed, but its economic strength was no longer the same. Byzantine merchants who once dominated trade routes and dictated prices began to compete for space with Italian and Turkish rivals. It was like watching a seasoned veteran slowly being overshadowed by ambitious youngsters. In everyday life, this change became visible. The warehouses were no longer as crowded, the markets lost some of their diversity, and even the currency, the Byzantine solidas, no longer held the same prestige as before. The city still breathed commerce, but with a shorter breath. Ordinary people noticed this not in political speeches, but in the simple act of buying bread or spices, increasingly expensive or scarce. Merchants, once respected as bridges between worlds, found themselves forced to reinvent themselves. Some began working as intermediaries for Italians. Others sought out smaller routes to keep their businesses afloat. The glory of controlling the Mediterranean had already faded, but the skill of negotiation remained a strong trait. After all, those born in Constantinople learned from an early age to deal with diversity and adaptation. Despite their decline, the legacy of Byzantine merchants did not disappear. For centuries, they kept the connections between East and West alive. They taught accounting, transportation, and even commercial diplomacy techniques that would influence future generations. It was as if each transaction had planted a seed that would flourish even after the empire's fall. This legacy was not only present in books or treatises, but also in cultural customs, the European taste for spices, the fascination with Oriental silks, the tradition of international fairs. All of these bore the mark of Byzantium. Even though the empire had disappeared, its contribution remained alive in the daily lives of distant peoples. And perhaps this is the greatest proof that trade goes beyond immediate profit. It builds invisible bridges, shapes cultures, and leaves traces that survive for centuries. And in the case of the Byzantines, even decline could not erase the memory of a people who lived as intermediaries between worlds. Byzantine influence wasn't limited to goods or routes. It also reached language itself. Many terms used in trade and navigation ended up crossing borders and becoming incorporated into Western languages. It was as if, in addition to spices and fabrics, Constantinople also exported words, and these words, discreet but powerful, shaped the way other peoples thought about and practiced trade. Imagine a Genoese merchant learning navigational techniques from a Byzantine. Upon returning to his hometown, he took not only goods, but also vocabulary expressions related to ports. Cargo contracts and measurements were assimilated, transformed, and adapted. It's like when we use English words like marketing or feedback today without even realizing their foreign origin. This phenomenon demonstrates how language is also part of commerce. Every transaction, every conversation at a fair was an exchange not only of values, but also of sounds and meanings. Sailors, in particular, played this role in spreading terms. As they sailed from port to port, they spread words that gradually took root in different regions. In everyday life, this was reflected in small things. An Italian peasant might use a Byzantine word without knowing where it came from, simply because it had already been incorporated into the market routine. Just as today we use technological terms without fully understanding their origins, but because they are part of our lives. This linguistic legacy is silent proof of Byzantium's strength. Even as the empire began to lose territory,
Its influence remained in the mouths of foreigners who repeated words learned in the capital's ports. It's as if the city had become eternal not just in stones or books, but in syllables that have spanned the century. And in a way, these words acted like seeds, planted in different languages. They continued to flourish, reminding the world that Constantinople was not only a bridge of goods, but also of ideas and language, an invisible legacy, but still present today when we study the origins of so many commercial terms. Byzantine trade didn't just transport goods, it also carried ideas. Amid barrels of wine and bales of silk, manuscripts, parchments, and copies of classical works from Greece and Rome traveled. It was thanks to this circulation that many ancient texts, which might otherwise have been lost to time, reached the medieval West. It was as if, along with the spices, also came the flame of wisdom. Constantinople's libraries were famous for housing rare copies of ancient philosophers, physicians, and mathematicians. Foreign merchants often had access to these texts, bringing them back to their own land. Imagine a Venetian merchant who, in addition to textiles, embarks with a scroll by Aristotle. He wasn't just selling merchandise, he was also selling knowledge. In everyday life, this transmission was not as visible as the sparkle of precious stones, but it was even more powerful. Copyist monks, supported by donations and taxes from commerce, dedicated their lives to reproducing books. Each copy made was like a new link in a chain of preservation. Without this silent effort, much of classical philosophy would never have reached Renaissance Europe. This intellectual exchange also shaped practical practices. Byzantine medical texts, based on Greek authors, circulated among Arab and European peoples, influencing treatments for centuries. Ideas of architecture, engineering, and even agriculture were transmitted along trade routes. It was as if each merchant was, without realizing it, also a messenger of science. The impact of this on the West was enormous. As medieval Europe began to open itself to knowledge, it found in Byzantium a bridge to the classical past. This contact helped pave the way for the Renaissance, which would flourish centuries later. Thus, Byzantine trade was not only an economic activity, but also a conduit for cultural inheritance. And to think that all of this often happened invisibly, while crowds were enchanted by fabrics and spices, between the lines, ideas, they traveled silently, slowly changing the course of history. It was further proof that Byzantium was not just a market for goods, but also a market for knowledge. May 29, 1453, was marked as one of the most dramatic days in history. Constantinople, the city that for centuries had been the heart of trade between East and West, finally fell to the Ottoman forces of Muhammad. The roar of cannons echoed against walls that seemed eternal, but which could not withstand the advance of new military technology. It was the end of an empire, and with it of an entire era of Byzantine trade. In everyday life, the fall was felt as an abrupt rupture. Merchants, who, the day before, had still been trading spices and fabrics, saw their shops looted or destroyed. Entire families fled for safety, taking only what they could manage. The vibrant routine of markets, ports, and fairs was replaced by the heavy silence of conquest. It was as if the heart of the world had stopped beating for a moment. For the West, the fall of Constantinople was a shock. For centuries, the city had been a bridge and a barrier, supplying goods and filtering cultures. With its capture by the Ottomans, the map of trade was redrawn. Italians, Portuguese, and Spanish began seeking alternative routes, sailing ever further afield. It was this movement that indirectly paved the way for the great voyages of voyage and the discovery of new worlds. The Ottomans, in turn, transformed Constantinople into Istanbul, maintaining it as a strategic center. Trade did not disappear, but it changed hands. Ships and caravans continued to circulate, only now under new flags, with new rules and new taxes. For many Byzantines, It was painful to see the continuity of what had once sustained their glory, but without their presence. The legacy, however, has not faded. The memory of vibrant markets, solid currency, gleaming mosaics, and cultural diversity continued to resonate even under Ottoman rule. Constantinople maintained the aura of being the place where the world met. And in a way, this heritage has spanned centuries, still inspiring those who reflect on its history today. Thus, the fall was not just an end, it was also a new beginning, opening the doors to new routes and new powers. The transition of commercial power from Byzantium to the Ottomans marked the beginning of a new chapter in global history, and trade, as always, would continue to be the driving force of the world. And so, after this long journey through Byzantine trade, tell me, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you just let it fall asleep with you, or will you see how much the present still bears the marks of the past? Think, if merchants centuries ago shaped entire cultures through their exchanges alone, what can you build with the choices you make every day? The routine may seem simple: wake up, work, return home, but deep down, each gesture is like a coin tossed in the great marketplace of life. What are you trading with your time, your energy, your relationships? Are you simply surviving, or are you creating something that will leave a legacy?
These questions may be uncomfortable, but they are precisely what bring about transformation. And that's why this dive into history isn't just curiosity, it's an invitation to reflect on what truly matters. If Byzantium, even in its decline, left traces that spanned centuries, you too can leave marks that will make a difference. The question is, what will they tell me in the comments what most caught your attention during this journey and what lessons you've learned for your life? I'd love to hear your perspective because every glimpse enriches this exchange, just like in the markets of ancient Constantinople. And of course, if you enjoyed this journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you can continue learning and reflecting with me on how the past can illuminate the present.